We continue our study of Exodus, and we are in Exodus the 18th chapter. I'll get it right. Exodus the 18th chapter. And it's interesting as we enter into this chapter how what's being described, or what's going to be described by Moses, is an interesting insight into what's going on with the Israelites on a day-to-day basis. This is one of the very few times that we see the inner workings of how disputes are worked out, how different things are handled on a daily basis in the nation of Israel. So Randall Bailey has some good thoughts to say in his commentary on this section, and I won't read the whole thing, obviously, for length purposes. But he talks about the fact that this is this conversation that he describes, that Moses describes between himself and Jethro, is very similar to that which is described in Genesis chapters 14 and 15 between Abraham and Melchizedek. And he has a lengthy chart on page 197 of his commentary showing the similarities between the two instances. And it's a very interesting comparison. He goes on to say, Bailey does, the text pictures Jethro as another Melchizedek, the paradigm of the righteous Gentile who instructs the lawgiver Moses relative to the administration of Yahweh's law to Israel. To a lesser degree, comparisons may be made with the wandering sojourner motif, Cain in Genesis 4, Ishmael in Genesis 16:21, Isaac and Ishmael, Genesis 25, Keturah's sons versus Isaac in Genesis 25 and Genesis 28, and Jacob and Esau in Genesis 33 and Genesis 35. Interesting comparisons when you look at it from that standpoint. But as we enter into the chapter, I'm going to point out some things that maybe you haven't thought of before, and also point out some things that my brethren in years past, some of my brethren, have said about this passage that is completely unjustified. We'll talk about it when we get there. Verse 1, Now Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Moses' wife Zipporah after he had sent her away, and her two sons, of whom one was named Gershom, for Moses said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. The other was named Eleazar, for he said, the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And that's an interesting side note that Moses hasn't talked about up to this point. All this time, the focus has been on Moses and Aaron and the deliverance of the Israelites out of Egyptian captivity. And we haven't heard anything about Moses' wife or his sons. Well, Moses now fills us in on what's been happening. His father-in-law had heard about this and had stepped in to help out his son-in-law. I'll take your wife, my daughter, I'll take the grandkids, and we'll keep them safe while you're doing this. This is an example of a righteous Gentile. Rex Turner Sr., I well remember sitting in his classes years ago in master's level work at what used to be ACSR, now is Amridge. And he would talk about the Gentiles that were highlighted throughout the Old Testament that were followers of God. Gentiles who were righteous before God. And he brought up Jethro as one such example. And I heartily agree with that. Jethro was a man who saw what God was doing. And it changed him. It changed him from being a worshiper of many gods to be a worshiper of the one true God. So he takes Zipporah, he takes Gershom, and he takes Eleazar, and he puts them in a safe place. Then verse 5, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness where he was camped at the Mount of God. Implied here is the fact that Jethro and Zipporah and Moses' sons have not been far from Mount Sinai. In other words, when Jethro heard that they were at Mount Sinai, he comes. That implies that there's not much of a travel distance involved in that. He sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her. Then Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and he bowed down and kissed him. And they asked each other of their welfare and went into the tent. Now that seems banal to us. In other words, it's just a detail that is mentioned by Moses with no significance at all to it. But what's interesting is that this reuniting that is described by Moses is significant in the sense that this is how greetings took place. In other words, Jethro took care of the daughter and grandsons, as we already said, and when he bows down and they greet one another and they really fill in each other about what's been going on, this is typical. This is typical in the ancient Near East of how individuals and families, patriarchs and families, would greet each other. So verse 8, Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had befallen them on the journey, and how the Lord had delivered them. Now, I think about these kinds of things in movie terms, as you already know. And this is one of those scenes where one of the characters is filled in on what's been going on up to this point. Everything that we've already seen, everything that we know, well, Jethro is now told by Moses. Moses tells him everything. It's similar in my mind to North by Northwest. If you've ever seen the movie North by Northwest by Alfred Hitchcock, you know that there's one scene in which the main character is being filled in by another main character on their way from the airport or the terminal to the plane. And instead of hearing the conversation, what Hitchcock does is he has the sound of the plane engines drowning out what's being said. So in all that time from the terminal to the plane, he's being filled in, but we don't hear it. That's so that it doesn't become repetitious to us. That's what Moses is doing. He's telling us, I'm filling in my father-in-law, but you already know. So we're not going to go back in and recount all those details. Interesting way of doing this as far as a storyline is concerned. Then he says in verse 10, so Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord who delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. Indeed, it was proven when they dealt proudly against the people. Jethro says, now I know. In other words, I've been going that direction for a while. Now I know. I'm convinced totally. This pushed me over the edge. This is the thing that was the deciding factor for me. Now I know that Yahweh, he uses that word. Notice the Lord is capitalized. That's Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. That's the unpronounceable name of God. He says, I know that Jehovah, Yahweh, is greater than all the gods. All the Elohim that is out there? No. Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is greater than all the Elohim that is out there. So, verse 12, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law before God. So this is a big event. This is something huge. We have a former idolater, a Gentile, as we would say, who now has become a worshiper, or actually a believer, now a worshiper because he's made a burnt offering, of the one true God. This is a big deal. So Moses calls not only his brother Aaron into the room, into the tent, he also calls all the elders of Israel in. This is huge. This is a proselyte, as we would call it. This is a Gentile who is now a believer in Jehovah. Verse 13. It came about the next day that Moses sat to judge the people. And the people stood about Moses from the morning until the evening. Now get this picture. Moses sits in a certain place, and all of the Israelites who have disputes come to him. He is the only judge in Israel. That's a lot of responsibility. That's a lot of work. That's a lot on one person. But this gives us an insight as to what's been going on up to this point. from the time they've left Egypt, when they crossed the Red Sea, until this point, Moses has been the only person arbitrating disputes. Yes, sir? Yes. On is one of the Egyptian deities, one of the Egyptian gods. It's interesting when you look at that too. The priest of On, when we were in that section in Genesis, Potiphar is wrapped up in that. It's a possibility, and I didn't bring this out when we were studying over the story of Joseph, but there are some scholars and some of our brethren who believe that Potiphar not only did not believe the story that his wife told on Joseph, but that later on he allowed one of his daughters to marry Joseph. And that would really shed significant light into the character of the man, of Potiphar. It's interesting. Potiphar was a priest. There's no question about it. But it was the priest of one of those Egyptian deities. You're absolutely right about that. This situation is Jethro, who has been a worshiper of many gods. He's been coming in this direction for a long while, and now he's completely a believer. And that's a significant thing. But this incident, Moses has been judging. The implication would be every day. This is an everyday thing, at the very least every week, that he is sitting down and he's arbitrating disputes. Now when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this thing that you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge and all the people stand about you from morning until evening?" His father-in-law is a practical man. His father-in-law is a wise man in a lot of ways, as we're going to see. Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, it comes to me. And I judge between a man and his neighbor and make known the statutes of God and his laws." So Moses said, this is just what's going on. This is what I've been doing. And the clear implication is this has been happening ever since we left Egypt. I'm the sole arbiter. And God works through me to say what his law is concerning all these disputes. Moses' father-in-law said to him, "The thing that you are doing is not good. You will surely wear out both yourself and these people who are with you, for the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone." Now, normally, in-law advice, you can take it or leave it, right? Sometimes in-laws can be a little, But, normally, if we're going to have a good relationship with our in-laws, it's a good thing. This is a situation where Moses and Jethro have a great relationship. And Jethro's trust and Moses' trust is such where they can just say things to each other to help one another. And Jethro sees this situation, and he's a very perceptive man. He says, "This thing's not good. You're going to wear out. You're not going to hold up under all this stress." That's another implication, that Moses is under a lot of stress because of what he's doing on top of everything else that he's got on his shoulders. Verse 19. "Now listen to me. I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You be the people's representative before God, and you bring the disputes to God." Okay? He says, you are the people's representative to God. And that's your responsibility. You bring the disputes before God. That's what he's been doing, but he's been doing it a lot by himself, as he's already indicated. He hasn't had any assistance up to this point. He hasn't had anything to give him any advice, anyone to give him any advice about these things. So he is by himself, as it were. So he says, you be the people's representative before God, and you bring the disputes to God, verse 20. Then teach them the statutes and the laws, and make known to them the way in which they are to walk, and the work they are to do. So Jethro was suggesting to him that the values that Moses had stated could be maintained without Moses being involved in the impossible task of trying to settle each case personally. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah.
And the other thing, you get to verse 20, here's the beginning of the educational system.
Yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right about that. Yes, sir. Yes.
Wouldn't that have been a good task for the elders to take some of the stress from Moses? When they had issues, they would come to the elders, and the elders would come to Moses instead of the people who were regulars.
I think you're really perceptive on that, because that is a prelude to what we're seeing here in this chapter. The stress level of Moses is through the roof. There's no question about it. And Jethro sees it. And Jethro says there's got to be a better way to handle all these things, to deal with all of this. So we come back to the passage, verse 21. Furthermore, you shall select out of all the people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain, and you shall place these over them as leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. Now, this is a smart arrangement in this particular situation. This is a smart arrangement in this context, because it takes the stress off of Moses as the only one arbitrating, and it distributes it. It diffuses it. And then Moses only deals with all of the arbitration, all the disputes that are critical. He can then handle that by himself. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are some brethren that have used this passage in an inappropriate way. I'll explain. Back in the 1980s, when the Crossroads movement, the Boston Crossroads movement was really heated up, there was a bulletin article that appeared in the Boston Church of Christ bulletin, in which they were announcing a new structure of their leadership of the Boston church, because they had grown so large that they needed to restructure the church. And so they said, we had 3 elders over a congregation of thousands, and they said, we're going to have zones in the town. We're going to have individuals over these zones, and then we're going to have a house church with a house church leader, and then we'll have prayer partners and the soul talk leader. And they based it not off of the New Testament arrangement of elders and deacons. They based it off of Exodus chapter 18. That was their biblical justification for that arrangement. This is not a justification for New Testament order of congregations, how the leadership should be structured. The New Testament is clear. There's one eldership over each congregation, not an eldership over one city where there are many congregations, not one eldership over the entire brotherhood, not one man over the entire church. You see where that's going, right? Roman Catholicism. That's straight from Roman Catholicism. Well, this is where the Boston church got their justification. This has absolutely no connection with the leadership structure of the church today or in the New Testament. This cannot be used for that purpose. This was a smart arrangement for Moses and the nation of Israel. No question about it. It took the stress level off of Moses, but we can't use it for justification today for what we do in the church. So, verse 22. Let them judge the people at all times, these individuals that are going to be over these groups. And let it be that every major dispute they will bring to you, but every minor dispute they themselves will judge. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this thing, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure. And all these people also will go to their place in peace. He says, if you follow this arrangement, everything's going to get much, much better on you. So verse 24, Moses listened to his father-in-law and did all that he had said. Moses chose able men out of all Israel and made them heads over the people, leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. They judged the people at all times. The difficult dispute they would bring to Moses, but every minor dispute they themselves would judge. Then Moses bade his father-in-law farewell, and he, that is, his father-in-law, went his way into his own land. So Jethro solves this problem that Moses had. He's now a full believer in the one true God, and now he leaves to go back to his home. So that's an interesting interlude, if you will, between what we've seen up to chapter 17, what we're going to see from chapter 19 on. This gives us an insight into how Israel worked, how it was before Jethro and how it was after Jethro. After Jethro's advice, which Moses gladly takes and implements, everything gets easier for Moses as the leader of Israel. And that gives us an insight as to how it was going forward from this point all the way to the land of Canaan, when they were about to enter into the land. So this, by clear implication, is how things were settled, how daily disputes, weekly disputes were arbitrated among the people. Moses handled the big things, and the leaders over all these different groups handled those things that were smaller and were less important. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Just look at that and compare that to the Canaan system where Moses federates. Exactly the same thing. You start at the little man and move up the ladder to the Supreme Court.
Right. It's a very good structure. And Jethro came up with this, and you're right. It's followed by many countries, including our own, I might add, in theory at least. The small stuff handled on the local level, the big stuff handled on the federal level. Very interesting. Yes, sir. Yeah. And you would think that Moses would have come up with this himself, but I guess he had so much on him that he didn't really think about it. He just thought, well, I'm the leader, I'm the judge, God's expecting me to do this, and so I'm just going to take it all on myself. That's a lot of times what men like that in that kind of position will do. They don't think about the stress that it's bringing upon them. They don't think about everything that's working on them in a negative way. They just do it, and they're blind sometimes to what's going on. Yes, sir. It doesn't say. He is a believer in God. I would not say at this point he's a full proselyte. I would just say that he is now a firm believer in the one true God.
It's interesting that he says, I'm a believer in God, and there's no indication. He knows that Moses is indicating all these Israelites in the promised land. They don't say, let me come with you.
Right.
He just gets sent off and goes back to his house, and Moses goes on his way. They don't know what the conversation was.
It's quite possible that Jethro decided to go back to his homeland to teach his outer family and his servants and all the people in his village about the one true God. We're not really told by Moses what happens after that. Yes, sir. Right.
All the structure of Israelites, the tabernacle, et cetera, that's not even been given yet. So
Right.
as it were, he being the Gentile, but living according to patriarchy, et cetera,
Yeah.
he'd be right in doing so.
I think you're right. In fact, you just stole my thunder in a sense, and that's good. In the sense that I believe that Jethro falls under the patriarchal law from this point on. In other words, he's a believer in one true God, yet he's not an Israelite. He's not a proselyte because of what you said about the law had not been given in its fullness yet on the old law. So at this point, he is under the same regulations, the same law as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would have been. Melchizedek would fall in that number as well. Melchizedek was a Gentile who was priest of the Most High God and King of Salem. So I would put them all in that same category. They're true worshipers of God, under a patriarchal type of arrangement. And in fact, it's interesting when you look at it from the time the law was given until the time of Christ. What about those Gentiles who believe in the one true God? That's a whole other story for a whole other class session. I believe patriarchy handles all that up to the point of the gospel of Christ being given. Yes, sir. Yes. Yes. Yes, sir. That's right. They both have something to give each other. And it's a wonderful thing. The grace of our God is a tremendous, tremendous blessing. And the grace of our God was extended to many people in the Old Testament time. And this is one example of that. Jethro, a Gentile, is now a believer in the one true God. And he, if he continues to live according to that belief from this point on, he will be justified by the future sacrifice of Jesus Christ. It's a fascinating thing, this scheme of redemption, how it all plays out and how it all works together. Yes, sir, John.
It's also an interesting thing to think about the humility that Moses had to have.
Yes.
And to kind of correlate that with us, those of us that have grown up in the church, sometimes we get the feeling of not to say big-headedness, but God's grace is more extended to us than people who have been, who are new converts, or who
Right.
have not grown up in a church, or a church for that matter, yet have in later life come to know God, come to know Christ.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same way with Jethro and Moses. Moses had, in a sense, grown up in the church, or at least had been God's chosen person, whereas Jethro had been this proselyte you were talking about. And now this proselyte, the person that has been brought in his old age into God, into this patriarchal system, is now instructing the man who is God's chosen person in how to structure his governance and to go about his daily business.
Absolutely. Good point. No matter how long we've been members of the church, how long we've been Christians, we can always take advice when it's given from the right motivation. A mark of a good leader, a mark of a really good leader is when he can take advice, constructive criticism, and build on it and use it for the good. And that's exactly what Moses is doing. He's taking this advice, this critique of what he's been doing up to this point, and there's a better way. And Moses doesn't say, well, what are you telling me? I'm the leader of Israel. I'm God's representative. I'm God's spokesman. He doesn't react like that. Moses has enough humility and enough meekness, and we're going to talk about the meekness of Moses later on in our study. He has enough meekness and humility to know that I need the best advice possible. And he takes that advice and runs with it. That's something we all can learn from. Yes, sir.
We start to think too, that Moses had lived with Jethro for 40 years.
Yes.
A relationship had developed.
Oh, yeah.
And I think both of them saw something in each other that they were feeding on each other.
Right.
This was just a continuation now of these good two men coming together.
Absolutely. When you've known somebody for 40 years plus, you know, they're like your family. Even though they may not be your blood kin, you know them just like you would a brother or a sister or a cousin, you know, because you know that person. You've been very emotionally intimate with that person, and you know that person inside and out. That's the way Moses was with Jethro. You can see that as this thing plays out in that chapter. Good comments. Chapter 19, we now enter into the second section of the Torah, believe it or not. Actually, what we've seen up to this point, from Genesis chapter 1 until the end of Exodus chapter 18, what we have seen up to this point is introduction. Believe it or not. Introduction? Yes, introduction. Because we have not entered into the law code, which is the Torah, as the Hebrews would call it. Yes, the book of Genesis is part of the Torah. Yes, the book of Genesis is part of the law. But the law code, as given to Israel, we have not encountered it yet. We're about to. So now we're about to enter into the second great section of the Pentateuch. We've already seen, over about 60 chapters thus far is going to be almost the exact same number of chapters from here on. Fascinating, isn't it? Fascinating. All of this introductory matter, all of this from getting them all the way from the creation to the other side of the Nile to Sinai, has all been building to this point. Fascinating, fascinating. In the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day, they came into the wilderness of Sinai. It's interesting what both Woods and Bailey have to say about this, and I won't read all of their comments because of time constraints. Mount Sinai, there's been a dispute as to the exact location of Mount Sinai. The wilderness of Sinai was a high plain on the mountain. This is usually identified with a plain just north of Jebel Musa. You can go and read further as to the location of Mount Sinai, where it would be located. I believe in the traditional location, which is in the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. There are others that would say it's at other places. I'm not convinced. I believe that the traditional location is likely the one that's correct. What Bailey does, though, in here, which I won't go into in great detail because, again, of time constraints, in pages 201 to 203 of his commentary, he talks about the encampment, of course, before Sinai. And he says that the 58 chapters of Sinai material, which is what we're about to enter into, thus form the socio-religious core of the Torah literature. 58 chapters of Sinai material. 58 chapters. The significance of this centering, he says, may be seen that the Sinai block presents not only the revelation itself, but also the covenant, community policies, legal rulings and norms, and the institutionalized expression, a religious structure with priesthood and offerings of God's relationship to Israel. In short, Israel became a nation in a special relationship with Yahweh. Now, what he also does in this commentary, and I highly recommend Bailey's commentary on Exodus, he spends about 2 or 3 pages contrasting and comparing ancient Near Eastern vassal treaties and the covenant that God makes with Israel. It's very interesting. Trust me, it's very interesting. When you look at the way the ancient Near Eastern treaties were structured, and you examine how this in Moses' writings is structured, you can see parallels. You can see exactly what he's doing with it. There are significant contrasts. There are significant differences. But in a large extent, it's not different from what normally was done between two parties in a covenant, in an agreement. So, verse 2. When they set out from Rephidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness. And there Israel camped in front of the mountain. So now they are set at the base of Mount Sinai. The promise that was made all the way back in chapter 3, verse 12, is now about to be fulfilled. Moses went up to God, verse 3. He's beginning to ascend the mountain, in other words. And the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel. The house of Jacob. Do you realize this is the only time the entirety of the 5 books of the Pentateuch that this phrase is ever used? The house of Jacob. This is the only time you'll ever see it. The house of Jacob, the sons of Israel. Verses 3 through 6 of this chapter that we're in serves as an introduction to the covenant that God is going to make. He's using the format, God is, that's found in the standard treaty ceremonies of the ancient Near East. What we're about to have displayed to us or described to us is not just filler, it's not just fluff, it's not fluff in fact. It is describing the way covenants are done. And this is no ordinary covenant. This is the covenant between the holy God and his people. Notice, verse 4. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. That's a beautiful description. God sweeps the Israelites up on eagle's wings and flies them away from Egypt. It's God's doing. More detail is given in Deuteronomy 32, 11, and 12 that we'll see when we get to that point. But notice this. Verse 5. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession, or my special treasure among all the peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. That is a beautiful, beautiful description of what God has done and what God intends to do for the nation of Israel. It's interesting. Notice, he says, my covenant. A covenant is, in simple terms, as we've said before, an arrangement between two parties. For previous divine covenants with Noah and Abraham, we've already examined those in Genesis 9, 15, and 17. The most central covenant of the Hebrew Scriptures is this, the one that God makes with his people at Sinai. This phrase that he uses, my own possession, my special treasure, the Hebrew phrase that's used by Moses carries the idea of highly valued property. God says, you are my highly valued property. You are my special treasure. If that did not make the Israelites lift up in their hope and in their love and in their reverence to God, nothing would. A holy God that has destroyed Egypt has borne us with eagle's wings from Egyptian captivity to this point, and now God himself is going to make an arrangement and agreement with us. That's tremendous. That is a tremendous picture when you think about it. The kingdom of priests that he says here. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests. The expression could also be rendered a priestly kingdom. The priest was a mediator between God and man. So that speaks maybe of Israel's mission of bringing other people to the Lord. Interesting, right? Certainly the choice of Israel as the Lord's people to carry out his purpose not only carried with it privilege, but great responsibility. Great responsibility. That factors in later on down the line when Israel turns its back on the Lord and forgets all that God had done for them up to this point, and forgets the covenant that God made, and forgets the fact that he said, you are my special treasure, you are my chosen people. Now, fast forward over the New Testament. And in 1 Peter chapter 2, we find the apostle making a very familiar statement, one that we've read over and over and over again. But in light of this, it has special meaning. 1 Peter 2:5. He says, you also, he's talking to the church, talking to Christians, as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house for a, watch it, holy priesthood. To offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. You skip down to verse 9 of that chapter. Again, speaking to the church, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Now do you see the significance of that passage? God is telling Israel, you are my chosen people. You are my special possession. You are a holy priesthood. But what's the purpose for that? To shine forth the praises of God. That's what Israel forgot. That's one reason of many why they fell into apostasy. And today we in the church as Christians have the same responsibility that they did then. It's just with a better covenant made with better promises and a better priesthood and a greater high priest. Now think about the responsibility that comes with that. You, all of you who are Christians in this auditorium, you all are priests. Male and female, all of us are priests. Now think about that. You can have the privilege of going to God in prayer and petitioning Him, and He will answer you because you are a priest under the great high priest. Now what does that also entail? That entails that you, just like the priests of Levi are going to be instructed to be holy, to keep themselves pure, ritually pure, always offering sacrifices every day. We offer up spiritual sacrifices every day, Romans 12, 1 and 2. We keep ourselves holy. We keep ourselves free from sin. Yes, we make mistakes. Levitical priests made mistakes. They sinned. But they continually were about the business of God. We are to be continually about the business of God every day that we live. It's something that we do every day from the time we get up to the time we go to sleep at night. It is a life that we live. We are God's priests. If that doesn't strike you as amazing and tremendous, then I'm sorry, you're not going to be moved by anything. It moves me every time I think about it. Thing about it is, we, like they, have this great responsibility to uphold. And this is what Moses was to tell the sons of Israel. This is who you are. This is who I am. This is your responsibility. This sets up what we're going to be seeing. This is just a prelude, folks. This ain't over by a long shot. This is just the beginning stage of the ceremony that God has with His people to give them the covenant that Moses would provide to the nation of Israel. It's a fascinating account. And next week, when we continue, we're going to look at verses 10 and following as to what else God would do in connection with this entire ceremony.